I'm a postdoc fellow here at the department. And I also recently, and I've also been working with an education consultancy called Oxford Measured, where we do a lot of sort of monitoring and evaluation work in the low and middle income countries, but also a bit in the UK. So today I'll be sort of talking about some of the methodological sort of aspects of my DPhil, which I finished at the department, I think about 2 months ago now, so very fresh off the bat. But the good thing is it's all fresh in my memory, so I can sort of share that with you. Before we get started, I was actually curious to see if anyone's ever done any sort of primary research in non-Western context. Or anyone hoping to, of course, Kathy. Okay, so we've got a good mix of people. So hopefully what I say will resonate with you and maybe even inspire you to continue to work in non-Western contexts. So on our agenda today, I'll start off with a bit of an overview of the study, what I planned, what my findings were, but I'm not going to focus too much on that because I want to really sort of talk about the methodological aspects of things, which often do get sort of lost when you're presenting things. So I really want to focus on that. And on that, I'm going to be talking about what I like to call some balancing acts that I had to do during my DPhil. I'm going to go through them in a chronological order. So starting off with a conceptual balance, which is what I sort of had to do at the start of my thesis when I was thinking about things. Okay, what do I want to focus on? What do the different theoretical frameworks I'm going to use look like? Then we'll come on to the technical balance, which talks about the method, designing the study. So the sort of measures that I use, how I have to balance those out. Then we'll come into starting to do the actual data collection. So the relational balance that has to sort of come in and how my positionality was sort of evident in that. And then we'll conclude with a bit about the ethical balance and also the contextual balance of just realities that happen when in these contexts. And then we'll finish off with some lessons learned and things to sort of look to or do consider when you're doing this kind of research. So in terms of the study, my study was based in Karachi, which is an urban city in Pakistan. It is one of the biggest and most diverse cities in the country. And just to give you sort of an idea, it is bigger than New York. It is massive and has a massive population to go with it. And my study sort of focused on preschoolers' social and emotional skills, but also their academic skills, so their pre-literacy and pre-numeracy skills. And I was interested in seeing how these sort of related to one another, but also how the classroom quality and children's own sort of demographic and family characteristics, how they predicted these skills. So in terms of my design, I had a longitudinal design. So I assessed children's outcomes at 2 different time points. So once in October and then again in the spring around April. And then we measured sort of classroom quality halfway through that in January. And we had about 600 preschoolers take part in the study, and they came from about 52 different classrooms, which also had about 82 teachers in them. And in terms of our findings, we found that emotion knowledge, which was one of the sort of social emotional skills, so predicted children's academic outcomes. So that basically means children who were better able to recognize other people's emotions and understand what those sort of emotions meant. They were able to better sort of, they had better literacy skills and better numeracy skills. And this is after controlling for those skills at the first time point. So early emotion skills related to sort of later academic outcomes. And I know a lot of that feels like, oh, that makes sense. And I know a lot of literature in the Western sort of context has proved that, but we don't actually have any of these findings in Pakistan or sort of similar contexts. So it was really good to sort of see, okay, those things also matter in this context. And in terms of demographic and family variables, we looked at a bunch of different things like children's gender, age, their household size, their home learning environment, as well as their parental education and parental age. And out of all of those, there's only one that was related to all 4 children's outcomes, and that was maternal education. So children whose mothers had completed either their secondary education or higher education had better outcomes than those whose mothers had no education at all. And household size was actually negatively related to children's social skills. So that basically means children who came from bigger households, they had poor social skills. And one thing that I haven't mentioned is that in terms of gender differences, we only found them for pre-numeracy skills. So with girls being or boys being better than girls in pre-numeracy skills, but then they perform very similarly on all the three other outcomes. And then when we looked at classroom environment, we found the quality of the classroom environment was positively related to all four outcomes. So classrooms that had better quality naturally had better outcomes on all of the four skills. Pre-numeracy was not significant, but it was still a decent effect size. I think it was about 0.11, which again doesn't seem big in sort of grand scheme of things, but within sort of this naturalistic education study design, it was a pretty good effect size. And we also looked at another aspect of quality that we looked at were teacher-child interactions and also structural quality, which basically refers to things like the teacher-child ratio or the number of children in a classroom or teachers' qualifications or teachers' age, for example. And we actually found that none of those things predicted child outcomes, which was really interesting because these things are seen as very important, for example, in the UK. So I had some good, interesting findings. But for me to get those, I had to juggle quite a few balancing acts, which I'll dive into now. But if anyone has any questions on the study design or the findings, feel free to ask, or you can ask them later during the Q&A.
Just the timeline, when the pre-test, and you told us when the quality assessment, and that's all. There's no academic outcome later on. It's just in that year.
Yeah, so just 3 data collection points just within one academic year. Yeah. It was a deep look. I would have not. Yeah, so in terms of any other questions?
Yeah. I was just interested in the teacher-child interactions didn't predict outcomes. And I was just wondering if you were using a scale that had been designed in like a Western context, or whether it was a scale that had been adapted for the context.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. Hopefully, once we start going into these things, things might get a bit more clear also. So the first balancing act that I started off with was obviously balancing global frameworks and what those sort of meant in the local context. So when I started sort of reviewing a lot of literature, I found that the way that ECE, which is early childhood education, the way that it was conceptualized or defined was through very sort of specific criteria that felt like it wouldn't be applicable in other contexts, or at least in the Pakistani context. For example, there is a lot of focus on the teacher-child ratios in the sort of literature, and even in the UK, for example, like you have to have a certain amount of like a certain ratio in order to be able to sort of provide ECE to children. There's also a lot of emphasis on free play in the frameworks. But obviously, I felt like if I went in trying to assess classrooms with this criteria, all of them would just do really, really poorly, and you wouldn't be able to sort of pick up on meaningful differences, which I knew were there because I'd visited a lot of the classrooms. I was familiar with what was already happening, so I wanted to be able to sort of pick up on things that mattered sort of meaningfully. And obviously, a lot of this makes sense, like the way that a lot of these frameworks and even tools that they've been designed to do research in very specific Western contexts. And if anyone's familiar with the term WEIRD, which is Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So these are the kind of societies that about 90% of their research, in not just education, but just generally in the human development even, gets done in like sort of these sort of contexts, but they make up a very small percentage of like the population of the world. So there's obviously a discrepancy there. So the way that I sort of dealt with that at this initial sort of conceptualizing stage was that I obviously explored those frameworks and I sort of picked up pieces of them that felt relevant to me. And for my literature review, I did sort of discuss those, but I did put sort of a caveat in there that, this is what the literature says, but we don't know whether this sort of matters in this context, and which is what this study is sort of going to look into. So recognizing, and obviously I would have loved to sort of done a deep dive into, okay, what does quality look like in this context, but obviously that was not in the scope of my DPhil. So I did sort of acknowledge that limitation, but then also seeing that, there has to be some sort of commonality in what is good for children, basically. So I sort of acknowledged that as much as I could, and then tried to answer some of those questions from the DPhil. And that also brings me to like the sort of second balancing act, which relates to the question we also got here, which is about balancing sort of rigor and feasibility in measurement. When you sort of obviously set out to do these studies, you have options of different tools available, right? And things have gone much better now that we do have tools that have been created in low and middle income contexts, and they've been validated. In some cases, they have also been validated for those contexts. And in some cases they haven't, so you always obviously have sort of limited choices in what you can do with them. And one of them is obviously like adapting those tools. And that poses a completely different risk because we don't know the tool that's adapted, whether it will work in that sort of setting and will be valid in sort of picking up the things that you wanted to pick up. And obviously going back to like not the Western design tools, there's obviously a big question of feasibility. So more than just validity, some things just aren't feasible. Like for example, like you can't just go and assess children for a whole day as you would like in a typical sort of another setting, like in the UK, for example, because you just don't have those sort of resources available there, or you can't work with teachers to that same extent that you would want to. So you would have to really sort of go about things in a more strategic and feasible way. So what I did for my thesis was that I sort of took this multi-pronged approach in the sense that I didn't sort of put all my eggs in one basket. I sort of divided it. So for my child outcomes, I chose a tool that was designed for the low and middle income context. It's called the IDELA, if anyone's interested. So it was designed specifically for those contexts, and it has been validated, including in Pakistan. So I had a lot of sort of confidence in choosing that tool. For quality, I tried looking for tools that were that had been designed for low and middle income contexts, and there were one or two that had been validated, but they just didn't have that. They sort of focused on a very specific aspect of the classroom environment, and I wanted to get like a more general sense of okay, what is even happening in these classrooms. So for that reason, I actually decided to stick with a tool that has been designed in the West, and I chose to adapt, and it's very, very well validated. It's been shown to link to sort of child outcomes, but so that's why I sort of chose that, and I chose to adapt it. And the tool I used, so there were two. One was for global classroom quality, and then one was for the teacher-child interactions. So the one for the interactions was less well validated, but it has been still used enough. So what for the pilot, so I actually, in order to adapt that, I did like a mini pilot before I started my data collection, and that involved going to two different types of schools. And one of them was what you would call a high quality school, in the sense that it was reputable, it was known to provide sort of quality education and had higher sort of a fee structure. It was also in a more sort of affluent part of the city. So I sort of piloted it in that setting purposefully to try to understand, okay, what is the maximum high quality we can achieve, or what does that look like in this country, for example, and to see whether that tool can even pick up on those things. So I really use that to sort of understand the lay of the land, and I also did it with a more low resource students and to see where like what's like the floor, like what is like possible in these sort of restricted conditions. And using those, I spoke a lot with my supervisors about that, on like things that, okay, there were some items that were just completely inapplicable. So we decided to sort of drop those. There were other ones that we sort of reworded a bit. And I also spoke with a lot of local experts, people who had done sort of similar work in like the early year space in Pakistan, and I sort of sat down with them and really went through the tool in a very in-depth sort of way to adapt it as much as possible, but also trying to keep the essence of the tool still intact, so it still sort of remained valid. So there was a bit of a risk, but I really wanted to use a tool that was valid because it was one of like my main predictors. So in terms of how things turned out, it was interesting. One of the child outcome tools that was really well validated in low and middle income context, the one for social skills, actually had low reliability. And we actually had some funky findings with that also. So that's to say, even if something has been sort of designed for low and middle income context, there's no guarantee that it will work the way that it's supposed to. And the quality tool, especially the one that was very well validated, it performed really well. So that we still had some sort of, not floor effects, but they were sort of skewed towards the lower end of the scale, but it still sort of predicted child outcomes in a meaningful way. And we were, not to say again, it was perfect. They could have like future work can like look to adapt it more, but it was able to pick things up. And I haven't mentioned here, but the teacher-child interaction scale, in terms of like reliability, it performed well, but there was a massive ceiling effect there. And I think what sort of happened, going back to that question, was that it picked up on a lot of sort of things that related to sort of child caregiving practices, and obviously those might not be sort of most important for what matters in the Pakistani context, but also that scale it sort of measured how warm teachers were and how much sort of how responsive they were to children's sort of interactions. And what I suspect happened is that there's a lot of like teacher-child interactions aren't the same. In Pakistan, they're a lot more hierarchical. So it's more like teachers telling children like this is what you have to do. And even if they might be saying it in a warm way, so that's why they scored well on that tool, but it was still very like didactic instead of it being like a two-way interaction. So it picks up on warmth, but it doesn't sort of pick up on interactions that are more meaningful. But I don't think it was a thing of the YouTube wasn't valid for low and middle income context. I think it just didn't pick up on the sort of aspects of things that we needed more for. Any question before we move to the third? Yeah. So as I started doing my research, sorry, excuse me. I obviously had to balance my positionality of being an insider and an outsider. So to give you some context, I grew up in Karachi. I'm very familiar with the context. I speak the language. And I was there up until like 18 years. I still go back quite often. So being from Karachi gave me a lot of access, but also this cultural fluency. But at the same time, I'm still an outsider because my background was very different than most of the participants that were included in the study. And also, I was affiliated with a UK institution, and not just any institution. I was affiliated with Oxford, which obviously came with its own sort of thing of, I was sort of seen, at least my understanding was I was seen as, someone who's crossed abroad, and sort of linked me with authority. So that obviously had to be dealt very carefully. So I negotiated those sort of perceptions in a way that obviously I understood my position, but I also tried to minimize the impact of that as much as I could and focus really on like building good relations with the people I was working with. So some small ways I did that was, for example, always showing some respect for teachers' expertise. I know this goes without saying, no one's going to be disrespectful, but I really just went out of my way to sort of highlight that the teachers are the experts and they are allowing me to be there in their classroom, and I am very grateful for that. Or they are taking out the time to have me. So I always sort of made sure that I really said, thank you, and like ask for their opinion, like small thing, just so that they also felt that they've had agency in the situation and they didn't feel like, okay, they were forced to do something that day, for example, like the school had asked them to do. I also made sure that I always sat on the floor with children. Again, it feels like this is something that's very normal in the West, children usually work. You work with children on like the floor over here, but over there, teachers are you even if the children are sort of sitting on the floor, teachers are always sort of given a chair to sit with, and especially if you have some like external person coming in, they're always like, sort of given a chair, and sometimes the teacher's chair, for example. So I would make sure that okay, you know what, I'm gonna sit on the floor, and whenever I was offered, I'd be like, no, thank you. But I also make sure not to say it in a way that came across as disrespectful, because it's a very fine balance. I always sort of had to emphasize, oh no, like I love sitting on the floor. I'm here to work with the kids, and I really want to play with them. And I want them to sort of see me as a friend. So I'm like happy to sit on the floor. And we always had these sort of conversations beforehand also. So it's not something that you have to like sort of muddle through in a classroom. I was also very fortunate. I got to work with some field workers. So again, the field team was very diverse, and they were also very familiar with the context. So a lot of them actually like they have been to some of the schools. So in many occasions, especially like introductory meetings, I would sort of like follow their lead and their expertise. So even though I was a leader, I was the one who's managing this. It was sometimes you have to sort of defer to where your expertise do not exist. So I deferred to them on a lot of things. And another small thing that we did was that even when we spoke amongst each other, we always spoke in Urdu, just to make sure that other people, like the other teachers or something there, didn't feel like, okay, we're talking in English, we're either talking about them or we're trying to sort of exert authority, because of colonialism and everything. English again gets seen as something that's a lot better, and we just didn't want to give that perception. So all of this is to say that, you know, even though I grew up in that context, I was still not a complete insider. And it's important to sort of accept that, but also know that, you know, that's not a problem, obviously. It's not a liability, but you do have to sort of accept your role of who you are in this sort of tricky situation. And then we come to sort of the fourth balancing act, which was on ethics. So this had sort of two aspects to it. One of them was around gatekeeping, for example. So this specifically came up with public schools in Pakistan. These are sort of state-funded schools, and these are managed by the ministry. And we were very lucky to get permission to work with these schools. And I remember when I went in for my meeting to get all the surveys, the paperwork done, the person who was leasing it was like, oh, do you want me to sort of call it to school and like set it up for you, so have an introduction? And I was like, yes, please, that's lovely. And then he called up experts, and right as I was sitting there, and thank God I was, they are just like, oh yeah, like we have this researcher from Oxford, and they want to do this, and you have to make sure you let them in, and you make all the children participate, and all the parents. And I was like, whoa, okay. That's it. So obviously once like he sort of put the phone down, I was like, oh, actually, like, you know, obviously not just, I didn't want to go back on it also, because inside I was like, yes, please, more participants. But then I obviously couldn't say that to them, because that would just sort of put a lot of unnecessary pressure on participants that I did not want. So I have to sort of really dial back, because obviously when you're trying to get permission, you really emphasize how important things are. And then once I had it, I was like, okay, I need to de-emphasize this, because this is like, you know, I don't want it to have sort of negative consequences. So I really had to be like, oh no, it can be fine. We have a lot of different types of schools also, and a lot of other people participating. So if a school's not able to do something, that's completely fine, and we don't mind it, we can either pick up another school or something like that. So really to just say, you know, it's okay. And then after that, I did all of the introduction calls myself. Just to make sure that, you know, it also doesn't seem like, oh, this is someone who's attached to the ministry, for example, and they're coming to like evaluate things. And that was a big thing. Like, so I always made sure that whenever I was having an introduction call, I would always say, oh, we're not here to like examine you or anything, but we just want to see and learn from you. That's how I really framed it, just to make sure, you know, it doesn't come across as something I'm like evaluating them. And also like the research team that I was working with, again, I think especially with kids, there can be like, there's a tendency to force kids to do things, like obedience is a very big thing in Pakistan. So there's people feel like you can force children to do things, and I think that was one of the biggest things that I started off my training with was voluntary consent, and just training them on to pick up signs of like distress or uncomfort, and always just saying, yes, I want to get as much data as I can, but not at the expense of children's well-being or even just their interest. If they don't want to do it, it's okay, like that's fine. So that was really important to sort of reiterate consistently, and it will come up at times that you would be surprised to hear about. So that was sort of one aspect of balancing sort of ethical challenges. The other is actually about collecting parental consent. So anyone who's had to deal with QREC form knows how tedious they can be. But more than the form itself, they give you like a template to be like, okay, this is how you should collect consent. And it's hard enough they obviously encourage you to use like simple language and all of that. It's hard enough still for an educated sort of English first speaking person to understand that. And then you take it, we even adapted it to Urdu, but the language was still just so, it was so technical because those were just things that we don't talk about in Pakistan. No one cares about data protection. I know it's like a very big thing here, but they don't care what you do with your data. But Oxford's like, no, you have to have these in. I was like, how do you explain this concept to someone where it's just not an issue? So I had to do a lot of back and forth with them on that and really had to explain my points. And the good thing was that they were sort of receptive to understanding things. And I did obviously reassure them also that, so I worked with some local partners and also schools to make sure that the form was sort of legible, but also got the things that we needed to. And what was really helpful was that I had a colleague who's worked or like, a friend or mentor was based in like a Pakistani university. So she was actually able to share the kind of transcript or script that they use to collect consent. And that really helped inform sort of my version of things. And again, I was able to push back like, look, this is how they're doing it here. And I think this is the sort of template that we should also follow. So I was able to get through. And again, that's to say, at the end of the day, especially if you're familiar with the context, you are the expert in that context. And so it's okay for you to like sort of push back on things and say, okay, I don't think this will work. So obviously we simplified it to a very sort of easy oral script in Urdu, and we also sort of worked with schools to identify different ways of collecting it. Obviously, forms, like you have forms and then you have like an oral script. But then one of the schools actually suggested, oh, why don't we encourage parents to just come to the school the day that you are visiting and you can collect consent then. And that actually turned out to be really helpful because a lot of parents don't have access to mobile phones, for example. And it also seems slightly dodgy if like some random person is just sort of like, like the schools are setting up a call and they're like, oh, actually here, talk to someone. So it ends up being a bit awkward, but when they come to the school, they also see you doing things. They can see, okay, you're like trustworthy, reliable people. And it automatically very like sort of reassuring for them. So that really helped us collect consent. So sometimes you just have to sort of get creative and really just work with the people who are already doing things there. That is the most helpful thing that I found. And coming to sort of my last balancing act, anyone who's obviously worked in non-Western or low-income settings will know how unpredictable things can be. And obviously the default doesn't really lend itself very easily to unpredictability, even like if you're doing your master's or just things here. I think everything's just in a very tight timeline and you have Gantt charts and you need to stick to everything. But obviously, and anyone who also knows me knows I'm a very stringent planner. I have everything down to the T, and I did in this case also. But even obviously the best designed Gantt charts will have to deal with things like unexpected school closure, floods, political instability, and just sometimes just people not being as efficient as you are. I mean, that obviously had a lot of sort of ramifications for my design. And I remember in the process of doing it, it was a very stressful experience. And obviously a lot of it was riding on the fact that this is my detail and I really wanted it to be the best it could be. And just to give you an example, we had, like I mentioned, 2 data collection points. So after like for the child outcome, so when we did the January one for the classroom quality, we sort of made sure we kept in close touch with the teachers and the schools to make sure that we were able to retain them for the third and final sort of data collection. So around like February, March, we're like, oh, like we're planning to come in April. Like, do you have like this is what we're thinking? This is what we'll need. Does it all sound good to you? Is there anything we should be aware of? And everyone's like, yes, brilliant. We love that. Come April, when I like got my Gantt chart and on my sort of schedule already, we sort of told me like, okay, this is the day that we're thinking of coming in. Does this sound good? And I remember one of them was just like, oh, I'm sorry, we've like shut down the school. And I was like, what? They're like, oh yeah, like we had like Ramadan or something, and then the kids weren't really feeling it anymore after that. So we just shut the early years. So they were still sort of going with the older grades, but they're like, yeah, we just shut the nursery and the KG sections. And it's like, but when I asked you, you failed to mention that or anything. So it was like, and like there were some of the most unpredictable things you'd hear. I think one of them was like, oh yeah, we are having board exams in our school, so we've again just let go of the early. So I think it also came a lot with the pressure of it being like early years isn't considered like proper education, so it's a lot more flexible, and like parents also feel less inclined to sort of send their kids, for example, in the summer. So yeah, we also the schools that did participate, we had a lot like low attendance. So the initial 600 sample of kids and the 52 classrooms we had actually ended up being 450 kids in 45 classrooms, which is still big if you think about it. But then I was like, but I want 600. So it was a tough pill to swallow, but I had to obviously remind myself of the bigger picture that, you know, this doesn't have to be perfect and this is all sort of part of the process. So that sort of really helped me on reflection put together sort of this framework. And lots of things I did sort of do implicitly, but it was never something that I had been explicitly encouraged to do. So maybe take this time to sort of think about that, you know, when you are, so obviously you have 3 different steps on preparing, responding, and adapting. So when you are, and the aim is to help you sort of build resilience in your research so that it can sort of weather different storms that will 100% come your way. And obviously one of those things is to help sort of build room in your design. And room could mean things like having a bigger sort of time allocated to things, or more budget sort of, so not having everything sort of clumped within a small amount of time. So for example, I had 3 data collection points, and the academic year isn't that long in Pakistan, so I had to sort of squeeze all of those in there. So in retrospect, I think I would still do things a similar way, but it just caused me a lot of stress, and that was fine for me. But yeah, give yourself as much time as you can, and as much as sort of leave room for things to go wrong, even in your budget. For example, schools will cancel, you will have arranged transport for it, and then they'll ask to reschedule, so you end up having to pay for transport for 2 things, for example. So have like leave the sort of cushion area in your plans. And then also pre-test logistics. I know I talked about piloting instruments, but I think piloting the way that things work is also really important. So one thing that we did was actually we had like introductory visits in all of the schools because we weren't familiar with a lot of like the route to get to different places, for example. So we made sure that we saw where each of the schools were, because obviously Google Maps and things don't work perfectly in Pakistan. And there's always a road for you like go on. So really helped us, okay, identify, okay, this school is a bit out of reach for us, or oh, this is the location for this is wrong. I swear to God, we spent for one of the schools, we got lost for 1.5 hours, and it was an absolute mess. But because we were able to sort of figure out, okay, this isn't right in that first visit, we were able to maximize the time on our actual sort of data collection visit. So really, yeah, pre-test those things, or if you're not able to test them, at least try to think them through and make sure that, you know, they're as like sort of strong as they can be. And also develop like contingency plan. So like I said, be prepared for things to go wrong. And I was prepared similarly for a lot of schools to sort of not want consent to be sort of part of the study, for example. So for in my case, there was one organization I was working with. They had like nonprofit schools, around 1,000 in the country. So they had access to a lot of schools, but I only selected 4 from them just because I didn't want it to be like an overrepresentation of their types of schools. But in the end, we had sort of some resources left that we could sort of go and visit schools. So we ended up asking them to just sort of give us a few more schools just so we could have like a better sample size. So yeah, have some backup options, some flexible sampling approaches that you can sort of use, especially if you're doing like a master's or a DPhil, like this is your sort of time to be a bit flexible in your things, and it doesn't have to be sort of set in stone. So like I said, yeah, leave some flexibility in there for you to make changes if needed. And then obviously you've prepared, you've gone in with as much of a resilient design as you can, and then you obviously have this sort of things, like I said, will come up. So you want to be able to sort of things like address things quickly, but also ethically. And I think one of the really important sort of takeaways for me through all of this was that my timeline is not that important if especially what was important was my relationship with these schools. A lot of like the people that I was sort of working with were being very gracious to me and having me and my team sort of come in and let them and help them do that work. And I can remember, I think we had like a visit planned with the school the next day, and the teacher called, like sent me a message at like 11 p.m. saying, "Oh, sorry, I don't think we can do the visit tomorrow." I was like, "What do you mean? Like set up everything and we have our transport arranged and all of that." And like this, like it was at an hour that it was literally at the 11th hour and I could not do anything about it. So it was basically like a day of resources wasted for us. And my initial response was to be like, "Oh no, you can't do that." But then I had to like, obviously I didn't say anything. I did sort of catch my breath and be like, okay, what's important here? And it was, I had the realization that, okay, it's fine if those resources like don't end up getting used. What's important is that I'm able to sort of maintain this relationship with the school. And I was very lucky that I was able to do that, because then that school was actually like, they sticked with us throughout all of our 3 sort of data collection points. And also like the teacher sort of helped me analyze it of this, like the findings. And I still keep in touch with her sometimes because she was very interested in our sort of findings. So it all ended up okay. So the importance is that, relationships are more important and things will go wrong. So try to sort of protect those before you sort of get to other things, and things will still sort of fall in place regardless. And just know that, this is part of the process. Like for a lot of people, this could be data also. My study was very sort of quantitative and I wasn't sort of looking at, like I didn't have any reflection logs or anything, but if that is of interest to someone, this could just end up being really valuable and useful data for you, just trying to understand why these sort of uncertainties happen. And then my last point is about adapting. So you've done your research study and you have a data set which doesn't look exactly like the way you had hoped for. And obviously you start off with accepting, that there is no such thing as perfect data. Like even if you are overseeing every single element of it, everything is still not in your control and things will turn out not the way that you want. And that's completely okay. I have planned very sophisticated and detailed analyses for some of my findings. I just wasn't able to do that because I wasn't able to sort of get enough of the sample size, but I think the models just didn't work the way that I wanted them to, and that was fine. I was still able to sort of redesign my analyses and try to sort of maximize whatever insights I could get from them. So there's always a way to go around things. I think stats is very generous in that way, like you will still be able to get some meaningful information out of your data. And all you can do is obviously just like be very transparent about those things, acknowledging that, okay, this is what I had planned, but unfortunately I was like these models didn't work, so this is what I've done instead. And that's literally, if you read my thesis, that is literally what I've said. Like because I've done all the coding and everything, I even put in my code and I said, this is what I have planned, but it didn't work. So people you are still able to sort of exhibit your skills, but also sort of be able to, this is what I actually ended up having to do with my data. So those are sort of the things that you can do to make sure that, your research you can still do some meaningful research by the end of it. I just want to see how I'm doing on time.
You're good. So we still have.
Okay, I'm on the last slide. Anyways. Okay. So in terms of going towards sort of looking forward, so for anyone who is sort of considering doing research in low and middle income contexts or in non-Western contexts, I really, really encourage you to do it because we definitely don't do enough of it. But I really encourage you to also just be careful and intentional in the way that you do it. And these are some sort of suggestions of ways to do that. And obviously one of them is just starting off with designing research that just, it reflects like what's actually happening in like on the field. And it's not just like theories and best practices. So also, yeah, just make sure that you are reflecting what is actually happening. And one really good way of doing that is to sort of working with people who are already working in the field. And I was really lucky. I was able to build connections with a lot of people, and they weren't always my partners, but I did consult with them informally or formally throughout my process, throughout the study. And I think that definitely made it much better than I could have done it by myself. And also, if you have to adapt things, that's completely fine. I did that. And so I think it's not something that you need to be worried about. Treat it as like sort of you trying to like innovate something. So it's not always a compromise, but you need to do it in an informed manner and need to be rigorous about it. Don't just mindlessly go adapting things. And I guess I've been saying throughout this talk, just be prepared for things to go wrong because they will. And at the risk of sounding slightly cringe, just accept that things will turn out the way that they should, even if that's not the way that you planned for them to turn out. And with that, I conclude my presentation.